At 7 years old, the state arrived at his door and claimed him without warning. He did not understand why his mother stood still instead of fighting to keep him. The men wore red cloaks and faces shaped by discipline rather than cruelty. They spoke calmly and informed him that he now belonged to Sparta alone. His mother knelt, steadied his shoulders, and told him to endure what followed. Sparta did not ask families for permission when it decided it needed their sons. It believed loyalty to the state must begin with separation from comfort. He was led away beside other boys whose silence felt heavier than fear. None of them were told how long they would be gone from everything familiar. Behind them, their homes shrank slowly into distant and unreachable shapes. Ahead stood stone buildings stripped of warmth, color, and familiar comfort. This was not a school in any way a frightened child could recognize. It was the beginning of the Agoge, Sparta's system of shaping obedience. Sparta believed softness weakened the city from its very foundations. Children were treated as raw material from which disciplined warriors emerged. On the first night, comfort disappeared without ceremony or explanation. Their beds were bundles of reeds, gathered by their own inexperienced hands. Blankets were thin, and the valley air carried a steady, biting chill. Hunger arrived before instruction and remained as part of the design. Food was rationed carefully, ensuring physical need never softened their resolve. They were encouraged to steal in secret, yet punished severely if discovered. The lesson was never about morality, but about competence and precision. Pain was described as instruction rather than cruelty within the system. Crying invited swift discipline and public correction, never sympathy. Sparta did not want boys who felt fear. It wanted boys who concealed it. The older boys watched them constantly, searching for hesitation and weakness. Supervision did not feel protective. It felt deliberate and suffocating. Every movement was measured against an unforgiving standard of obedience. They were ordered to speak rarely and endure hardship without complaint. Silence quickly became safer than honesty inside those stone walls. Physical training began before dawn, when the cold air cut into their lungs. Bare feet struck hardened ground as they ran until their chests burned. Strength was built through repetition, exhaustion, and public humiliation. When one boy faltered, the others were punished without exception. Sparta believed shared suffering produced loyalty stronger than affection. Fights were encouraged to test courage, dominance, and emotional control. Injury was ignored unless it prevented standing or continued movement. Bruises became proof of progress, and scars marked silent advancement. Food remained scarce by design, sharpening hunger into discipline. They were taught that survival required cunning more than fairness or mercy. If a boy stole successfully, he was praised quietly for his precision. If he was caught, he was beaten harshly for incompetence. The lesson was not morality, but efficiency and emotional control. Compassion was described as weakness that endangered the entire group. Older youths were granted authority to enforce discipline with force. Power flowed downward through fear, example, and silent approval. No adult intervened when boys turned brutality upon one another. Control was learned through repetition until hesitation faded away. Affection thinned gradually, replaced by calculation and restraint. By the second year, childhood had already begun to disappear. By adolescence, fear no longer appeared openly across their hardened faces. Emotion had been trained into silence and carefully measured expression. They learned to endure pain without sound, flinch, or outward protest. Beatings were delivered calmly, without anger, as structured instruction. Punishment followed clear rules, making suffering predictable and controlled. They were reminded daily that Sparta trusted visible strength alone. Weakness was framed not as failure, but as betrayal of the entire city. Hunger no longer shocked them. It sharpened their awareness and restraint. Sleep was restricted deliberately, forcing body and mind to adjust. Friendships formed cautiously beneath rivalry, and constant evaluation. Trust existed only within the boundaries of shared and measured suffering. They were praised openly for endurance, never for kindness or compassion. Questions about fairness were dismissed as childish and dangerous weakness. Honor was described as something earned through silent and visible endurance. Stories of fallen warriors were told without softness, ritual, or grief. Death was presented as acceptable if it strengthened Sparta's authority. The boys began to measure themselves against impossible expectations. Failure was internalized quietly, long before it was exposed publicly. Shame grew more terrifying than injury, hunger, or exhaustion. Silence during hardship became a private and defining source of pride. The strongest youths were elevated and granted controlled authority over others. Power, even among adolescents, carried responsibility without compassion. Discipline gradually blurred into sanctioned cruelty without boundaries. Sparta did not remove fear, it redirected it toward shame and disgrace. Affection faded gradually, replaced by calculation and emotional restraint. Laughter became rare and was often treated as weakness or distraction. Pain was no longer resisted. It was anticipated, endured, and managed. Ambition shifted from survival toward recognition within the ranks. Approval from superiors became more valuable than comfort. By manhood, hesitation had been replaced entirely by calculation. When they reached late adolescence, a quiet selection began without warning. Those chosen were told little, yet everyone understood its significance. Selection was framed as honor, though it carried unspoken danger. They were ordered to leave the barracks alone after nightfall. No armor was issued, and no witnesses were permitted to follow or intervene. Each youth carried a simple blade and strict instructions to remain unseen. Their mission was described as protecting Sparta from hidden threats. The Helots, enslaved beneath Spartan rule, became their primary focus. The state presented these missions as defense of order and stability. In truth, they served as lessons in controlled and sanctioned brutality. Young men moved silently through fields and scattered rural villages. They were instructed to strike swiftly and disappear without leaving witness. Mercy was described as weakness that endangered Spartan authority. Each action was meant to sever hesitation at its deepest source. Killing was introduced not as chaos, but as disciplined obligation. Fear was no longer something to conceal, but something to deliberately inspire. The darkness became both shield and silent accomplice to their purpose. Those who hesitated risked disgrace, suspicion, and permanent distrust. Returning at dawn, they were expected to show no visible emotion. Violence had shifted from training exercise to lived and sanctioned experience. By the time they were recognized as men, softness had been stripped away. Sparta had shaped them into instruments of discipline and control. They no longer feared pain. They feared failing the city. Individual desire mattered less than collective survival. Obedience was no longer enforced. It had become instinct. The system had succeeded in creating warriors without hesitation. Yet, something quieter and deeply human had been sacrificed in the process. Compassion, curiosity, and innocence had gradually disappeared from them. Sparta produced soldiers who rarely questioned the cost of obedience. It did not raise sons, it forged weapons in the shape of obedient men. If you enjoy exploring history beyond the myths, consider subscribing for more documentaries like this. And as always, thank you for watching.